Okay, we are going to talk about setting up inter-VLAN routing, enabling a switch for routing, and some other caveats that go with Brocade routing in their ICX switches. What I have in front of me here is a blank ICX 6450. This might as well be a 6450, a 6610, or a 6430. They're all essentially the same. They run the same operating system, so if you are running like an ironware or a different version of the Brocade switch software, it's going to be similar, but this is somewhat specific to this ICX line of enterprise switches, so just keep that in mind. This switch is completely blank config, and when they come out of the box like this, Brocade sets them to boot to their primary flash, and when you see here where it says ICX 6450 24P switch, that means that it has been set to boot to the switch or the layer 2 code, the switching code. So the way we can determine what's loaded and what we can do with this is we do show flash. Okay, and the output from this command will give us some information. The primary boot code and the secondary boot code, you'll see one of these has an S in it for switch and R for routing. Now we've booted to the primary flash so that we're only in the switch code. We can't route with this code. So you could either copy some routing code to your primary flash or just boot to your secondary flash, which is what we're going to do here. So if you go into the configuration terminal, the old config t command, and say boot system flash secondary right mem, and exit and reload. We're going to reboot the switch now. And this doesn't take very long. Now as we look at the boot monitor, there is we can hit B in order to interrupt the boot, and say you forgot your password or something like that, you can reset your password and reset the OS at that point. Sort of like changing the config register on a Cisco switch, just a little bit easier to figure out. Okay, so now we've booted. Nope, we'll do a little bit more boot to go. Now you can see that it's been changed to the word router. So now we know that we're in the routing code. We can also see in the boot here that the software that was loaded was the base router software package. So the base software package covers things like OSPF. It could do BGP, but in a very limited fashion, RIP routing, things like that. But what you would expect to see in a corporate environment is what it supports. So now that we're in the routing code, if you plug a bunch of switch ports in, it will act like a switch. We haven't actually started routing yet. The only difference between this code and the switching code right out of the box is that spanning tree isn't enabled. So you won't be sending BPDUs out of these ports until you enable spanning tree. Keep that in mind if you're in the switching code, that it does start off automatically with the spanning tree, so just be aware. At any rate, routing in VLANs on a Brocade switch is somewhat similar to, there's really two ways of doing it, and the first way is the typical router way. So we'll go in the configuration terminal, and we'll pick an interface, and we'll say no. No switch port. We'll actually just give it an IP address, and we'll give it some IP address. 24. Okay. Now show IP INT, and there's nothing plugged into that port, but at any rate, when you do the show IP, you'll show that interface shown up, and that is a port with an IP address on it, and it's ready to go for routing. You do not need to type no switch port. I made that mistake because I actually just took a CCNP test where you needed to run that command. On the VCS switches, the VDX line, if you're in the Brocade VCS series switches, the no switch port actually doesn't turn it off from being a switch port and turn it into a routing port. That command actually turns it into either a hybrid or FCOE port. So just keep in mind that we're in a different type of switch if you're used to the Cisco way of doing things. So now, if you were doing a router on a stick, what I just did would be fine for routing. You could plug in the port there. Another thing to keep in mind that you can add more IP addresses to it if you wanted to. We could be 10.200.27/24 and do show IP. Exit out of this, show IP. Show IP interface, excuse me. And that now has 2 IP addresses on it. So you do not need to do sub-interfaces if you don't want to. I think it can do sub-interfaces. I've never seen anyone actually do that. So if you have a situation where the talking port on the other end is going to carry more than one IP address or be talking on more than one network, then this might be appropriate. In a router on a stick environment, that might be helpful. I don't know many people that actually do that, so this is really for if you actually have a traditional router, plug it into your switch. Let's say this would be an appropriate configuration if you're connected to another person's router that's out of your administrative control. This is a good way of doing it also, because we can use the virtual Ethernet or virtual switching interfaces, but this is just a little more straightforward than that. Speaking of virtual router interfaces, that's what we're going to get to. Now let's say typical situations we have a bunch of VLANs on this switch and we want to route them. Well, then let's get to it. We'll review how to set up VLANs, and we'll just say VLAN 10, and we'll say we'll untag E114 to 116. Okay, and exit out of that and do VLAN 20, untag E117 to 119, and VLAN 30. We'll go to 1112. Okay, so we have a couple of VLANs showed up. So we do show VLAN. We'll see some VLANs in there. A note about this output: what you're going to see is, say, port VLAN 30, untagged ports U1, M1. What does that mean? Unit 1, backplane 1, or management interface 1. These switches have more than one of the M. So if this was M2, then we're looking at the couple of ports on the other ASIC, which is, in this case, it's a 10 gig interface. So you do show INTBR. You'll see all the 1.1, and then you have 1.2, the 2 being the second management ASIC. And so if you had an untagged port there, let's say, then that would show something different. So look at show VLAN again, and we'll go down to VLAN 30 since it's the end of the output. So let's say one of the fiber ports was plugged in or untagged. You would see this is M2. Unit 1, it will oftentimes be Unit 1. If you have this in a stack, which I think these can go in a stack of 5, then this will change depending on what stack position the switch is in. So it might be 1, it might be 2, it might be 5, and then you would call the port by, say this was actually Unit 5, then it would be 5, 1, and then one of these ports. So just a quick note on how to interpret the output from some of these show commands that might be a little bit different than what you're used to. At any rate, so now we have these ports set up, and we don't want to use a router on a stick. So what we actually do is go into the VLAN. Let's go into VLAN 30 and say use. Actually, you don't use. That's an old command. Router interface VE30. Now that you've typed that, in the VLAN configuration section, we are going to type INTVE30. Here is where you put the IP address for your entire VLAN. We'll give it 50.1/24. Okay. Now when you do show IP INT, you'll see that VE30 shows up in here. You do not need to type router or anything special in here in order to have directly connected interfaces route to each other. Okay. So if I go in and say, let's go to VLAN 20, and we'll say router interface 10.10.60.1/24. Oh, excuse me. I'm one step ahead of myself. Router interface VE20, and exit out of there and go INT VE20. Now we're going to say IP address 10.10.60.1/24. Okay, there you go. Ports plugged into these two VLANs will now be able to route to each other without doing any special commands, any router commands. Additionally, if you have, say, everything in VLAN 20, another switch down the line with a tagged link to this switch, this IP address will still route just fine. Let's say you have a router, a traditional router plugged in to this switch, and you untag, a port in VLAN 20 to that switch, to that router, and you plug it in, it will still be able to talk to this IP address. It's just a virtual Ethernet address, so it's pretty flexible. And you can also leverage OSPF RIP against these interfaces. And I think we're getting up close to our time, and we'll deal with the routing protocols in another video.